And I think that's what's missing from this. Like everyone is always so certain. Like a week after the pandemic started, everyone was so certain. Like I know exactly what's going on here, but it's like with a situation this big, like even after 9/11, you couldn't know everything that happened six
No.
months after. Like you had to take the time to really dive deep into it, right? So I think sometimes taming those instinctual, reflexive kind of emotions about it is important,
Yeah.
right? Not to the point where you silence that inner conscious, because that intuition is really your driving engine to inquiry. But if we're just like reacting kind of on instinct to stuff, we're not really getting at the truth, right?
Yeah, it's like, even watching some of the breakdowns in relationship between, I mean, I can't say that it's fully there. I just saw some stuff on Twitter between the guy from Rebel Wisdom, David Fuller, and Brett Weinstein, and seeing kind of the fights going back and forth about, I mean, to be honest, I felt Dave handled himself really well, but, Brett was kind of like, he's almost trying to say you're unethical for having done, having had this other guy on your show to challenge my views. And I'm just thinking, like, I don't, like, isn't this the point? Like, what are we asking for when we say we need an alternative or independent media that has a voice? What are we asking for? Are we asking for someone to just come through and have one side? Whatever this perspective is, we need the polar opposite, right? Or are we
Exactly.
asking for balanced inquiry, which is almost non existent in the mainstream today? And I think that's an important question because right now, and I think you touched on this, is the idea that the alternative, people assume it's like, well, if it's in the alternative, it's probably correct.
Right. 100%. And that's where ego comes into play too, I think. When you have sort of these huge figures, these kind of iconic figures in alternative media who anytime they're challenged, they sort of, just scream at people or say, how dare you challenge me?
Yeah.
Uh, Aren't they becoming essentially the mainstream? Like
Right.
they're essentially becoming the voice of the mainstream, which is batting down any challenge to it.
Yeah.
And where room for healthy dialogue, where's there room for checks and balances or critical thinking if we're just abandoning one narrative and replacing it with another that's equally problematic, which can happen
Yeah.
in the alternative media, right? The whole utility in alternative media and conscious media is that you have a healthy skepticism and you're utilizing critical thinking. You're challenging yourself to have neutral thinking, balanced thinking. But if you remove all of that and just say, hey, you just need to accept what I say without questioning it, that's essentially the same mindset as somebody who just follows the mainstream media and doesn't question it. So
Yeah.
where's the utility? Where's the value in that? Right?
Sure. Yeah, 100%. And like I recall back to 2020, I created a video just kind of sort of challenging some of the statements that David Icke had made on that Brian Rose, I guess those series of interviews that he had done. And I remember thinking, and this goes to the question of like, is it our responsibility, right? So we'll leave the idea of is it our responsibility there for a second, right? And I looked at I looked at that thing and I thought immediately, I'm like, these statements are going to lead to a huge amount of backlash, right? these are certain. They're said very abruptly and certainly without this level of curiosity and inquiry. They're just like, look, 5G is this, and there is potentially no virus at all, and there's this. And it wasn't presented, and this is important, but it wasn't presented from this standpoint of like, hold on a second, like here's what I'm exploring, this is potentially what's happening, what's going on. Of course, Brian Rose didn't question or challenge anything, he just kind of sat there. And I'm not saying any of them did anything wrong. I'm asking the bigger question of responsibility. I felt that was going to lead to a lot of problems. And that was really the start of the height of all the censorship that happened around COVID. That was like almost like the beginning where it just went everywhere. And I think to myself, is it upon us as people, as citizens, to be more wise, if you will, perhaps more strategic, maintain that level of curiosity and balance? Is that the responsible thing to do? Versus just saying, well, I have free speech, I can say whatever I want to say, and if I get deleted, then that's a problem. And I'm not saying I agree with that, but I'm saying,
Right.
what is the responsible thing to do?
100%. That's such an important point, Joe, because I think we both are pretty staunch defenders of free speech. I mean, we believe really there's very few circumstances, if any, where it really should be curtailed. But with that does come responsibility, right? It's really not a question of like I want people to kind of shift the mindset when they think about free speech. It's part of the question is, do you have a right to free speech? Do you have a right to unabridged free speech? When should you be censored? When should you not be censored? But it's also, what do we do with that immense right that is relatively new to humanity? There's not a lot of societies that have sort of a liberal perspective on this to where they really stand for the civil liberties and free speech. So what do we do with that responsibility? And if we're not kind of living up to that and living up to our true self and using that free speech in a productive manner, is there more of a tendency that that's going to be taken away from us? I would say the answer is yes. So not that we shouldn't resist that, but just the point is in the utility of it, are we exercising our right to free speech and freedom of expression in a productive and responsible manner such that we're living up to really the beauty and value of that right?
Yeah. 100%. And it kind of leads to, some people might respond to that. And I've had this happen to me throughout this course of the pandemic as well. It's sort of like they'll respond saying, yeah, but we absolutely know that, PCR tests are unreliable, or that some people will say, we absolutely know there's no virus, or that, this is all a part of the Great Reset. And I say, look, I've done all that research too. I agree with a lot of these things, maybe not so much the no virus thing. I've looked into that pretty extensively. I'm not sure I feel pretty good about that at all. However, I agree with all these things, but I'm saying what the evidence honestly states, which is that this is not black and white, right? Like this is pretty complex. It's evolving stuff. And so the question becomes, if we're using our free speech to, and this I think goes to your point, to say, well, here's absolutely what's going on, and you're an idiot if you don't see this, and you're a sheeple if you don't see this. I'm just saying, ask the question, is that the responsible thing to do? Does the evidence actually say that, or does the evidence maybe point to that? But there's a lot that's needed to really kind of show what's going on. Like, I just feel like there's a comeback for this kind of stuff all the time that pushes it towards, I should just be allowed to say whatever I want to say and I don't care about the ramifications.
Right, exactly. And you know what? I can understand that perspective, but I mean, I would push back to that and say, sure, you can say whatever you want to say, but let's draw a distinction between sort of making a good faith effort to report something or to say something. Even in the PCR test example, there's a lot of data to suggest that it is problematic.
Yeah.
But you should always keep in mind that there is a chance that we may not be 100% correct in what we're presenting at any given time because situations are fluid, more data is coming in. So it's useful to keep in the back of our mind that it is possible that I may not be 100% correct in this. And that, I think that humility helps us to be better critical thinkers too.
Yeah.
But also the distinction is, are people making a good faith effort to exercise their freedom of speech? Meaning, are they presenting ideas, presenting information in an honest, genuine way with integrity? Or are some people just kind of abusing the freedom of speech and saying, hey, I'm just going to peddle anything I want, regardless of whether it's true or not. I don't really care. I'm just saying it because I can say it. Now, do we really want to, people may have a right to do that, but I would argue that's not high value speech. It's not speech that we're going to necessarily hold a lot of value towards because it comes from kind of a bad faith intention just to spread information because you can, as opposed to taking the responsibility to really present something that is resonant with who you are as a person, is backed by credible evidence and insight, and you've taken the time to reflect on it. That's more high value speech, in my opinion. So regardless of whether or not you have a right to say something, I think it's important to put behind a higher value to what we present out into the world.
Yeah, 100%. This is the idea of maintaining that balance, maintaining that curiosity, that responsibility, that wisdom of connecting. And this kind of leads to one of the final points. And this sort of ggets brought up a lot. And we mentioned it, the whole idea of people just start calling names to the opposite side that they're opposing, right? So in the mainstream side of things, they might, all these unhinged conspiracy theorists, blah, blah, blah. Maybe in the alternative side, it's always like these people are sheeple, they're dumb, they go along with everything, their vaccine has fried their brain, right? It's insults, and they go both ways. There's absolutely no denying they go both ways. And the question is if you're, researching this COVID thing and you've figured out, I think pretty obviously at this point, that there's something wrong with the mainstream narrative. There's pretty much no denying that. Now, what exactly is wrong and how clear is all of it is evolving over time, right? The stakes are high, right? We're losing our liberties in some regard. There's increased surveillance and tracking. There are definitely some more pressing issues that we need to act. So the question becomes, how do we act? And one of the biggest things for me has always been about communication, right? How do we actually communicate with people on the other side? Because right now what I'm hearing is it's just echo chambers everywhere, right? Alternative media is as much an echo chamber as a mainstream can be. And it sort of just becomes, well, the other side, we throw names at them. And we just kind of have to ask the question is, what is the potentially the wisest or most effective thing to do? Like, can we actually look at other people and ask, like, how do they come to that belief? How do they come to that idea? And how might I present them with information that gets them thinking versus that just seeks to insult them? Like, I feel like that's a big part of this whole thing as well, is really, taking it upon ourselves to effectively communicate.
100%. I mean, to echo what you just said, I think people have really drawn up upon tribal lines when it comes to this. The polarity is more intense than it's ever been. And I think in that situation, it may be good to take an ambidextrous approach to say, hey, I'm not necessarily interested in being on one side or the other here. I can actually look at maybe a mainstream report on ABC, and maybe there's a scientist that presents really good information that I'm going to accept and take into account. Likewise, if I go to an alternative source that's presenting something the mainstream media is omitting, maybe purposely omitting, I want to take that into account as well and synthesize sort of my perspective based on critical thinking, data, and more of a holistic approach as opposed to this polarity of saying, hey, is this person on my team or not? Because if they're not, I'm not going to listen to anything they say, to where we villainize people. And now people are villains just because they don't necessarily agree with our worldview. So I think that resistance to that polarity in a sense of where you can actually stand balanced and say, hey, I'm open to perspectives and I'm not necessarily prejudicial regardless of what media source you're on, but I have a healthy skepticism because I see maybe a trend of mainstream media not presenting things authentically or in an honest manner. That's important, but not to the point where you just dismiss everything wholesale.
Yeah.
That's on a source, because I think there's good and bad reporters at every outlet. And, as a consumer of information, it's important to remain balanced and grounded so that you're not sort of just cutting yourself off in an unbalanced way to where you're only listening to one perspective. Because at that point, you don't become well-rounded in your perspective.
That's it. That's all. I mean, I fully agree with what you had to say there. And just for the viewers, like, our other channel, Collective Evolution, is kind of a place where we have a lot of the tools and sort of the practicals on how to improve aspects of our critical thinking, our state of being. In our membership, we have a course that is all about critical thinking as well, which interestingly is much of an inner transformation process as it is just a cognitive process. There's so much to be said about the more personal or spiritual side, if you will, of that process. But David, thanks so much again for a fantastic conversation here.
Yeah, I appreciate you, Joe. And just a note to all the viewers, you should definitely check out that masterclass with Joe and our brother Madhava. I mean, it's phenomenal. And I think it really will help people as they try to navigate this wild west of media that's out there today. So thanks, Joe. It's good to be with you.
That's it. That's all.